On the 15th of February, 2025, Addilyn Smith, 11 years old, full of light and a love for cheerleading that her coaches and teammates would carry with them long after she was gone, was found in a Las Vegas hotel room alongside her mother and would never return home to Utah. Tonight, her story. The city of Las Vegas, Nevada, is one of the most recognizable cities in the entire world. And yet, it is also one of the most misunderstood, because when most people hear the name Las Vegas, they think of the Strip, of the towering glass hotels and the blinking lights and the sound of slot machines and the rivers of people moving through enormous casinos at all hours of the day and night. And while all of that is real, it is only one layer of a city that is far more complex and far more human than its most famous image suggests. And it is important to understand this about Las Vegas before we move into the story of Addilyn Smith. Because the events of this story did not take place in the world of entertainment or spectacle. They took place in the world of a hotel room occupied by a mother and her daughter who had traveled to the city for something entirely ordinary, entirely wholesome, entirely beautiful in its simplicity. A cheerleading competition, a weekend away, a chance for a young girl to do the things she loved most in front of judges and coaches and teammates. And Las Vegas in February is a city that belongs, in many ways, more to the families and the athletes and the conference goers than it does to the gamblers and the nightlife seekers. Because the cooler months of winter bring a different kind of visitor to the Mojave Desert. They bring the kind of people who are looking for a large venue, a hotel block, a ballroom or a convention space where their sport or their organization can gather. And in February of 2025, the city was doing exactly what it does every February, opening its enormous doors to families from across the American West who had come for competitions and events of every description. And among those families was a woman named Tawnia McGeehan, 34 years old, who had driven or flown from the state of Utah with her 11-year-old daughter, Addilyn Smith, so that Addilyn could compete in the cheerleading event that she had been preparing for. And the city of Las Vegas, with its wide desert sky and its mountains visible on the horizon, and its vast hotel lobbies, and its corridors of carpet, and its rooms that look out over the flat geometry of the valley, was simply the backdrop for what was supposed to be a perfectly ordinary weekend in the life of a child who loved to cheer. And I want you to hold on to that image for a moment. The image of a city that goes on around the edges of every private story. A city that is always open, always lit, always moving. While inside its many rooms, the most private and the most human things are happening. And in one of those rooms, on the 15th of February, a story was ending that should have had decades left to run. And the desert outside was cool and still, and the lights of the Strip were burning as they always burn. And no one outside that room knew yet what had happened inside it. And so we begin, gently at the beginning, with the girl at the center of this story. And the rain continues to fall softly outside as we do. Addilyn Smith was 11 years old, and she was the kind of child who made an impression, not because she was loud or because she demanded attention, but because she was genuinely, completely herself. And there is a particular quality that some children have. A quality that is very difficult to describe, but very easy to recognize when you are in the presence of it. A quality of wholeness, of showing up entirely, of not holding any part of themselves back from the things they care about, And Addilyn had that quality, and the thing she applied it to most fully was cheerleading, competitive cheerleading, the kind of cheerleading that requires not just physical ability, but also precision and timing and teamwork, and the kind of mental focus that many adults would struggle to sustain. And Addilyn had been a member of Utah Extreme Cheer, which was a competitive cheer organization based in Utah. And the team, by the accounts of everyone who was a part of it, functioned as something more than just a sports organization. It functioned as a community, as a family, as a group of young athletes and coaches and parents who had built real relationships through the shared work of training and competing together. And Addilyn had found her place in that community in the way that the best kind of belonging happens, not through effort or performance, but through simply being who she was and letting the people around her respond to that. And her coaches responded. Her former coach, Emily Morgan, was quoted in the days following her death as saying that she always knew Addilyn was going to go far, and the reason she gave for that certainty was simple and deeply resonant. She said it was Addilyn's attitude, and what that means in the specific context of a competitive athlete is that Addilyn was someone who took her craft seriously, who understood that the work you put in is a reflection of the respect you have for what you are doing, who showed up to practice as her full self and demanded the same level of attention from herself in the gym as she would give on the competition floor. And she was 11 years old, and she understood that. And the rain falls softly outside, and I want you to stay with that for a moment, because it is remarkable. The things that some children understand about themselves and about their work and about what it means to be part of something. And Addilyn understood it, and her coaches saw it. And when Utah Extreme Cheer released their public statement in the aftermath of her death, the words they chose were not the words of an organization fulfilling an obligation. They were the words of people in genuine grief, people who had lost someone they loved, someone who was woven into the fabric of what they had built together. And the statement said that she was so beyond loved and that she would always be a part of their family. And I want those words to sit in the air for a moment, because they are not small words. They are not easy words to write about a child who is gone. They are the kind of words that can only be written when the loss is real, when the absence is felt in a specific and irreplaceable way. And Addilyn Smith's absence was felt that way by her coaches and her teammates and by the broader cheer community in Utah that had watched her grow and compete and develop into the athlete she was becoming. And she was 11 years old, and she had a future laid out in front of her that was full of possibility, full of competitions and achievements, and the kind of growth that only comes from years of dedicated practice. And she deserved every year of it. She deserved every practice and every competition and every moment of joy that her sport was going to bring her. And I want you to hold her in your mind as we continue, not as a tragedy, but as a person, as an 11-year-old girl with a cheer uniform and a passion and a team that loved her and a whole life waiting. The family circumstances that shaped Addilyn's daily life were, like the family circumstances of so many children in the contemporary American landscape, the result of a divorce and a custody process that had unfolded over several years and had eventually reached a point of relative stability. And Addilyn's parents, Tawnia McGeehan and her former husband, had divorced in the year 2017. And in the immediate aftermath of that divorce, According to court records that were later reviewed and reported on by local media, Tawnia McGeehan had temporarily lost custody of Addilyn, and it is worth saying clearly that temporary loss of custody in a divorce proceeding is not an uncommon outcome, and it does not, by itself, tell us very much about the character or the capability of the parent involved. Custody determinations are made by courts on the basis of evaluations and recommendations and legal arguments, and they are made at a specific moment in time with the information available at that moment, and they are subject to change as circumstances change. And in the case of Tawnia McGeehan, they did change, because by the year 2020, she had been granted joint custody of Addilyn. And from that point forward, the arrangement had provided Addilyn with a presence from both of her parents in her life. And according to James Watts, who served as Tawnia McGeehan's attorney and who spoke to the media in the aftermath of the tragedy, Tawnia had during this period been a supportive and engaged parent who had invested herself in Addilyn's passion for cheerleading, who had been the kind of parent who shows up, who drives to practice and sits in the stands and makes the trip to the competition and cheers from the sideline. And that is a real thing. That is a meaningful thing. And it matters to acknowledge it because the story of a family is never one-dimensional, and the story of a parent is never reducible to the worst moment of their life. And beneath all of this, beneath the custody history and the joint arrangement and the cheerleading competitions and the seemingly ordinary rhythms of a shared parenting situation, something was happening in Tawnia McGeehan's inner life that the people around her did not fully see or fully understand. And this is the part of the story that is the most difficult to hold. Not because it is graphic or because it is sensational, but because it is invisible. Because it happened inside a person in a way that left no clear external trace. No moment that anyone can point to and say, there, that was the sign. That was when we should have known. And the absence of that moment is one of the most painful things about a story like this one. The way that crisis can build in a person quietly and without announcement until it reaches a point that has no return. And I want you to breathe slowly now, to let the weight of that reality settle without rushing to make sense of it. Because some things do not resolve into easy sense. They simply ask us to sit with them, and the rain outside continues to fall, steady and soft, as we move forward. On the morning of February 15th, 2025, the cheerleading competition that had brought Addilyn Smith and her mother to Las Vegas was in full swing, and teams from across the region had gathered at the venue. Athletes in uniform and coaches with clipboards and parents finding their seats. And among all of those families gathered to watch their children compete, there was one family whose daughter had not arrived. And when the coaches of Utah Extreme Cheer looked for Addilyn and found that she was not there, and when they tried to reach her by phone and received no answer, and when the minutes passed and then more minutes passed, and there was still no word from the girl who was supposed to be there, and who would not have simply not shown up without a reason, a decision was made that reflects something very important about the kind of community Addilyn had been a part of. Her coach reached out to emergency services and requested a welfare check on Addilyn and her mother at their hotel. And this is an act that deserves to be named and recognized, because it is an act of love, of community responsibility, of the kind of attention that every child deserves from every adult who is a part of their life. And the request was received. and officers from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department were dispatched to the hotel, and they went to the room where Tawnia McGeehan and Addilyn had been staying, and they knocked on the door, and there was no response. And the officers at that moment did not have enough information to determine that the mother and daughter were in danger. There was silence on the other side of the door, and silence alone, in the absence of other indicators of distress, does not give law enforcement the legal authority to force entry into a private hotel room. And so the officers cleared the call, they logged it, and they left. And I want you to pause here for just a moment and sit with that. Because it is a moment that I think about when I think about this story. The moment when help was as close as the other side of a door, and yet the circumstances and the law and the information available did not allow that door to be opened. And this is not a criticism of the officers who responded that morning. It is not a failure that can be attributed to any individual. It is a reflection of the gap that exists between the systems we have built to protect people and the reality of what those systems can see and respond to. And the hours passed, and the city of Las Vegas went on around the hotel, and inside the room, the silence continued. And over the course of the morning and into the early afternoon, hotel staff received additional requests for welfare checks from other concerned parties, and those requests prompted additional response. And it was fire officials arriving on scene in the early afternoon who found, on a door at the hotel, a handwritten note. And that note, whose contents have not been made public as of the time of this recording, was enough to shift the nature of the response, enough to signal to the officials on scene that this situation was something different from a routine welfare check. And at approximately 2:26 in the afternoon, fire department personnel communicated to dispatchers that they believed there had been a possible suicide attempt. And at 2:27, hotel staff entered the room, and at 2:35 in the afternoon, ambulance personnel transmitted the words that ended Addilyn Smith's story, confirming to dispatchers that they had found an adult woman and her child deceased inside the hotel room. And those words, adult woman and her child, are words that belong to the clinical language of emergency dispatch. And yet they carry inside them the full weight of an irreversible human tragedy. The end of a life that had barely begun. The last hours and days that Addilyn Smith experienced in the world were hours and days that she shared with her cheerleading community, with the teammates and coaches who had traveled with her to Las Vegas for the competition. And it is in those final, ordinary moments, the moments before the morning of the 15th and the silence that followed, that we find the most human and the most meaningful portrait of who Addilyn was, and what we know from the accounts that coaches and community members gave to the media in the aftermath of her death, is that Addilyn had been present in every sense of the word. She had been engaged, she had been prepared, she had been the kind of athlete who shows up ready, who has done the work and knows it, and carries that knowledge with her in the way she holds her body and moves through a space. And the coaches who knew her saw that in her, saw the readiness and the focus and the quiet pride that she took in being prepared for the thing she had been working toward. And there is something deeply important in that image. The image of Addilyn Smith in the days leading up to the 15th. Thinking about her routine, running through her timing, feeling the particular kind of anticipation that a young athlete feels when the competition is close and the preparation has been done, and all that remains is the performance. And it is that image that her coaches and her teammates will carry with them. The image of Addilyn ready, Addilyn present, Addilyn as she was when she was most fully herself, and when she did not appear at the competition venue. On the morning of the 15th, the people who carried that image of her understood immediately, in the way that you understand something when you know a person well enough to know what their presence feels like, that this absence was not ordinary, that something was wrong, and the call that her coach made to emergency services that morning was a call made from that understanding, from the knowledge that this child would not simply not show up. And the rain falls softly outside, and I want to honor that. The fact that someone who knew Addilyn well enough to know that her absence meant something was present that morning and made that call. Because it is the kind of action that reflects the deepest kind of care for a child. The willingness to say, I am not sure what is wrong, but something is wrong, and I am going to do something about it. The investigation that followed the discovery of Addilyn Smith and her mother, Tawnia McGeehan, in that Las Vegas hotel room was conducted by the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, commonly referred to as the LVMPD, which is the unified law enforcement agency serving both the city of Las Vegas and the unincorporated townships of Clark County, Nevada, and it is one of the largest police departments in the western United States, an agency with dedicated homicide and forensic investigation units and significant experience in handling the full range of cases that a major metropolitan area generates, including the most complex and the most painful, and the detectives and forensic specialists who responded to that hotel room on the afternoon of February 15th began the work that death investigations always require, the careful and methodical documentation of a scene that must be preserved and processed and understood before any conclusions can be drawn. And the work of a forensic death investigation is, by its nature, a slow and deliberate process, because the evidence at a scene is the only record of what occurred in the absence of witnesses, and every piece of that evidence must be handled with precision and documented in a way that will support the findings that are ultimately reached. And in this case, the investigation moved through its stages and arrived at a conclusion that was communicated publicly by the LVMPD in the days following the discovery. The conclusion that Tawnia McGeehan had fatally shot Addilyn before turning the firearm on herself. And this conclusion was drawn from the physical evidence at the scene and from the forensic analysis conducted by the Clark County Office of the Medical Examiner, which is the agency responsible for performing autopsies and making formal determinations of cause and manner of death in cases of sudden, violent, or unexplained death in Clark County, Nevada. And the medical examiner's findings in this case were consistent with the scenario described by the LVMPD, and those findings became part of the official and permanent record of what occurred in that room on the 15th of February, and the note that had been discovered at the hotel, the note that had been the signal to fire officials that something was very wrong, was collected into evidence by law enforcement investigators, and its contents were not made public. And Tawnia McGeehan's attorney, James Watts, confirmed to People magazine in the aftermath of the case that he was aware that a note existed but had not seen it. And he expressed the hope of McGeehan's family, specifically her mother, that the note would in time be returned to the family once law enforcement no longer required it. because McGeehan's mother had expressed a desire to understand what had been written in those final moments. And I want you to pause here for just a moment and sit with that, with the image of a grandmother reaching toward the last written words of her daughter, trying to find in those words some explanation for something that may ultimately resist explanation. Because grief does that. Grief reaches toward understanding even when understanding is not fully available. And sometimes a note gives us something, and sometimes it gives us very little. And what it cannot give us, ever, is the fullness of the answer. The complete and satisfying explanation for why something happened that should not have happened. And that incompleteness is something that the families touched by tragedies like this one carry for the rest of their lives. And the rain continues to fall softly outside as we stay with that. Under the laws of the state of Nevada, a case in which the investigation concludes that both the victim of a homicide and the person responsible for that homicide are deceased follows a pathway through the legal and coroner system that is distinct from the criminal prosecution process. And it is worth taking a careful and thoughtful moment to understand how this works, because many people are unfamiliar with it, and understanding it matters to understanding how cases like this one are resolved. And in Nevada, as in all American jurisdictions, a criminal prosecution requires a living defendant, a person who can be charged and who can appear before a court and who can be tried and, if convicted, sentenced. And in cases where the person responsible for a homicide has died before charges could be filed, whether by their own hand or by other means, there is no prosecution because there is no defendant, and the case instead is processed entirely within the coroner's investigative system. And in Clark County, Nevada, the Office of the Medical Examiner and Coroner holds jurisdiction over the formal determination of cause and manner of death in all cases of this kind. And the coroner's inquest process, which in Nevada is governed by Nevada Revised Statutes, Chapter 259, allows for a formal public inquiry into the circumstances of a death. And while this process has been modified over the years and is not universally applied in every case, it represents the state's mechanism for creating an official public record of what occurred in the absence of a criminal trial. And the findings of the LVMPD investigation in the deaths of Addilyn Smith and Tawnia McGeehan were officially characterized as a murder-suicide. And those findings carry the weight of the law enforcement and coroner's determination and become the permanent official record of the case. And Nevada Revised Statute 200.030, which defines the crime of murder in the first and second degree, and NRS 200.508, which specifically addresses the abuse, neglect, and endangerment of children, define the legal framework within which harm to children is categorized and addressed by the state of Nevada. And while those statutes could not be applied in the prosecution of anyone in this specific case, because there is no living defendant, they represent the legal and moral foundation upon which Nevada's commitment to the protection of children rests, and the child death review process, which is a multidisciplinary review conducted by representatives of law enforcement, child protective services, the medical examiner, and other relevant agencies, exists in Nevada as a mechanism for examining not just what happened in a given case, but what systemic lessons might be drawn from it. And while the findings of any such review in this case would not necessarily be made public, The existence of that process reflects an institutional acknowledgement that tragedies involving children must be examined carefully and with a commitment to learning, so that the systems charged with protecting children can be improved and refined and made more responsive over time. The news of what had happened in that Las Vegas hotel room on the 15th of February spread through the cheer community in Utah first, and then through the broader communities of social media and local television news, and then outward into the national conversation. And the response at every level was characterized by the same qualities: grief, disbelief, love, and the particular aching tenderness that the loss of a child almost always generates in the people who hear about it, whether they knew her or not. And Utah Extreme Cheer published a statement on their social media platforms in the hours and days following the news. And the statement was brief, but it carried a weight that brief statements sometimes carry more effectively than long ones. She was so beyond loved, the statement said, and she will always be a part of the UXC family. And in the comments on that post, and in the posts that followed from individual coaches and teammates and parents and members of the broader cheer community, the image that emerged of Addilyn Smith was consistent and clear. This was a child who had been genuinely seen by the people in her life, genuinely known, genuinely loved in the specific and irreplaceable way that you can only love someone who has become a real part of your daily world. And local media in Utah, including KUTV, which reported extensively on the story in the days following the discovery, reached out to the people who had known Addilyn and gave them the opportunity to speak about her in their own words. And the former coach Emily Morgan spoke about the attitude that Addilyn had brought to her work, about the certainty she had felt that this child was going to go far. And those words were not retroactively idealized in the way that words about the deceased sometimes are. They sounded like something that had been true before it became a memorial, like something that had been observed and remarked upon in Addilyn's presence, and not just in her absence, and on a national level. People magazine covered the story and gave it a wider audience, and the national conversation that briefly surrounded the story was one that touched on questions of child safety and parental mental health, and the systems that exist or that fail to exist to support families in crisis. And those questions were asked with the earnestness of people who had been moved by the story of a child and who wanted to understand what could be done, what could be learned, what could be changed. The story of Addilyn Smith is, among many other things, a story that asks us to think carefully about what it means to protect children, and about the systems and the practices and the community relationships that are supposed to provide that protection. And it is worth spending time with this, because it is not a comfortable subject, and it is also not an optional one. And the first thing to understand is that child safety in the United States is a layered and complex system. A system that involves federal law, state law, local agencies, community organizations, and the individual choices and actions of the adults in children's lives, and in Utah, where Addilyn lived. The Utah Division of Child and Family Services, known as DCFS, is the primary state agency responsible for responding to reports of child abuse, neglect, and endangerment. And DCFS works alongside law enforcement and the courts and community partners to assess risk to children and intervene when intervention is needed. And the national resource that sits beneath all of these state and local systems, and that is available to anyone, anywhere, at any hour, is the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, which can be reached at 1-800-422-4453, and it is staffed by trained crisis counselors 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in more than 170 languages. And it is free, and it is confidential, and it is there for anyone who is concerned about a child. Whether the concern is clear and specific, or whether it is more of a feeling, a sense that something is not quite right, and that sense, that feeling, that intuition is worth trusting. Because the adults in children's lives are often the first and sometimes the only people who are in a position to notice when something is wrong, and the warning signs that a child may be in distress or in danger include changes in behavior that are sudden or unexplained, withdrawal from activities or friendships or interests that the child previously found joyful, expressions of fear or sadness that seem disproportionate or persistent, and physical signs that cannot be satisfactorily explained. And these signs require attention and, when present, action. Not because action is always easy or always welcome, but because the cost of inaction in these situations can be irreversible. And I want you to pause here for just a moment and sit with that. Because in the context of Addilyn's story, it is one of the most important things I can say. The systems that protect children depend on the people around those children being willing to act on what they notice, to make the call, to ask the question, to say something feels wrong and I am going to do something about it, rather than wait, and for adults who are themselves struggling, for parents who are in crisis or who are experiencing mental health challenges that are affecting their ability to care for their children. The resources that exist include the National Alliance on Mental Illness helpline at 1-800-950-NAMI, which is 6264, and the Crisis Text Line, which is available by texting HOME to 741-741, and the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which can be reached by dialing or texting 988 from anywhere in the United States. And these resources are not signs of weakness. They are not last resorts. They are infrastructure. They are the scaffolding that holds people up when they are not strong enough to hold themselves. And they are available before a crisis becomes a catastrophe. And that distinction, the distinction between before and after, between reaching out and not reaching out, is where so many of the most painful stories like this one live. Addilyn Smith was 11 years old, and she is gone. And there is no sentence I can write that fully contains what that means. There is no framing that makes it feel proportionate to the reality of it. The reality of a child who was full of passion and skill and belonging and love, who did not come home from a weekend trip to a city that was supposed to be just a chapter in a much longer story. And what we owe her, what we owe every child whose story has ended before it was finished, is the willingness to carry them with us in a way that matters. Not just to grieve and then to move on, but to let their stories inform the way we pay attention to the children in our lives, the way we listen and the way we notice and the way we act on what we notice. And Addilyn's legacy is not the story of how she died. It is the story of how she lived. It is the story of a girl who threw herself fully into the thing she loved, who took pride in her craft and her teamwork and her commitment to the sport that had become her community, who was so beyond loved by the people who knew her that their grief at her loss was immediate and profound and ongoing, and that love, that community, that legacy belongs to her. It is hers. And the cheer community in Utah that mourned her and that continues to hold her name with care is doing something that matters simply by refusing to let her be reduced to a news cycle or a statistic, by insisting on her full humanity, by saying her name and remembering her face and honoring the work she put into her sport and in the broader conversation about child safety and parental mental health and the systems that are supposed to support families before they reach the point of no return. Addilyn Smith's story is part of the evidence that we need to do better, that the systems need to be more connected and more responsive and more capable of reaching the people who are struggling before the struggle becomes something that cannot be undone, and the people who work in child advocacy and mental health and social work and law enforcement and all of the other fields that touch the lives of families and children carry the weight of stories like Addilyn's with them. And that weight is not a burden to be put down. It is a responsibility to be honored, a reminder that the work matters, that every intervention that happens in time and every call that is made and every welfare check that leads to a family getting the support they need is a child protected, a story given more chapters. And Addilyn Smith deserved more chapters. She deserved all of the chapters that her talent and her passion and her community and her whole bright self were pointing toward. And we remember her tonight with the kind of care and the kind of dignity and the kind of quiet, sustained attention that she deserved every day she was alive. And her name is Addilyn Smith, and she was 11 years old, and she was loved, and she was going somewhere. And we do not forget her. And so we arrive, slowly and gently, at the end of tonight's story. And I want you to breathe now, to let your breath come slowly and evenly, to feel the weight of your body where it rests, to let the heaviness of the day and of this story settle into something that is not despair, but remembrance. The kind of remembrance that lives quietly inside us and shapes the way we move through the world, the way we notice and care and act. And the rain outside continues to fall, as it has been falling all through this story, soft and steady and without urgency. The kind of rain that asks nothing of you except that you rest, that you let your eyes close and your breathing slow and your mind release the day and the week and all of the things that have been asking for your attention. And we have been in the presence tonight of a story that is difficult and real and that belongs to a child who deserved so much more than the ending she received. And we honor her by remembering her, by saying her name, Addilyn Smith, and by carrying that name with us as we rest, as we sleep, as we wake tomorrow and move through our lives with a little more attentiveness, a little more willingness to notice and to act. And I will be here tomorrow night, and the night after that, and the rain will be here too, as it always is. And tonight I ask only that you sleep well, that you rest deeply and peacefully, that you let your body and your mind find the restoration they need, and that tomorrow you wake with the gentleness that Addilyn would have recognized, the gentleness of someone who takes pride in what they do and shows up fully for the people and the things they love. Sleep well tonight. The rain stays with you, and I will see you again tomorrow.